Exclusive image of that unidentified object shot down over Yukon last year. So here it is. That's the image. This grainy picture comes from an email printout obtained by CTV News. This object was shot down by a U.S. fighter jet last February when concerns over suspected spy balloons from China, everyone was talking about it around the world, made international headlines. So this image was actually cleared to be made public shortly after the object was shot down, but then it was held back. Why? The Department of National Defense thought it may cause more confusion.
Daniel Otis, a freelance investigative journalist for CTV News, has been covering Canadian UAP-related stories for a few years now. Today, we'll focus on one of the most recent reports, the release of a mysterious image of an object shot down over the Yukon in February 2023. We'll discuss the details of this image and explore what we know about the object, initially described as a cylindrical metallic balloon, and why it took so long for the images to be publicly released despite being cleared months earlier. We'll also dive into how the image compares to earlier descriptions and whether it confirms any of the speculation surrounding the event. Daniel will help us break down the redacted emails, the possible reasons behind the delay, and also touch on NORAD's role, why the efforts to recover debris were just abandoned, and what experts believe this reveals about vulnerabilities in our North American defense systems. Join us as we get rebelliously curious. Daniel, thank you so much for joining me on Rebelliously Curious today. As a fellow Canadian, talking to another fellow Canadian that works in media, I'm excited to have this conversation with you. I feel lucky because I'm the first person. I know I wouldn't have been if you weren't sick, but happy to have you on the mic and talking about the Yukon shootdown that happened in 2023.
Hey, thanks so much for having me.
How did you get the story? How long have you been following it? And can you tell us a little bit about the shootdown and what happened in February 2023?
Yeah, so if you want to go back to early 2023, there was a headline-grabbing incident about a suspected Chinese surveillance balloon that traversed the continent of North America before being shot down off the U.S. Atlantic coast. Immediately after that, there were 3 other objects that were detected and shot down by U.S. fighter jets. An object in Alaska, an object over Lake Huron, and an object over Canada's Yukon territory. So my most recent story was basically based upon the first known image that's been released of this object that was shot down over the Yukon, which was described in documents as a suspected balloon. And through the Freedom of Information system here in Canada, that a black and white grainy version of that image has been revealed. I'm still trying to get a better copy. And there's a lot of internal emails describing this image, showing how it was distributed within the Canadian Air Force and military within days of the shootdown incident, which was on February 11th, 2023. And then just as quickly as this image was declassified and cleared for public release, a public affairs official with Canada's Department of National Defense came in and basically said, we shouldn't be releasing this because it will create more questions and confusion. And then that image never saw the light of day until about a year and a half later when it came out through a Canadian Freedom of Information request.
It's so wild. And there's something in the story about, I believe it was you were waiting or somebody was waiting on the American government to review the material. Do you know that maybe if the government did and they're the ones that potentially stopped it, did you hear anything of that? Did any of the emails or notes refer to that?
Well, the emails that were contained in this information release package were heavily redacted. If that information was there, it would have been redacted. Those email chains reveal a senior national defense public affairs official, quote, saying that the image, quote, will create more questions and confusion. And then we have an email from another public affairs official who was the public affairs officer for basically the head of the Canadian military, saying that any release would be pending U.S. engagement. Um, as many people may know, no images have been released of these three other objects. We got plenty of photos of the suspected Chinese surveillance balloon, but the Alaska, Lake Huron, and Yukon objects, no images were put into the public domain. I mean, just the other week, there was an encounter where American NORAD fighter jets had a very close call with a dangerously maneuvering Russian fighter jet. The video for that was released almost immediately. It's clear that photos and videos of these objects exist. Most of these fighter jets are equipped with systems to capture things like that. And, oftentimes these pilots have cell phones that they're snapping photos with. There is imagery out there, but none of it was released. There's a lot of things that the documents I obtained don't say. They don't say who took the photo, for example. But I mean, if something was being cleared and declassified within the Canadian military, it would seem to me like the photograph would have been taken from a Canadian aircraft. That's unconfirmed, but we wouldn't be having conversations with senior military members talking about declassifying a US image, because that wouldn't be in our domain, right? So there's still a lot of things that are unsaid. I'm trying to get more information on this. I'm trying through multiple avenues to get a better quality version of this photo. I've been told anecdotally by a source, who's familiar with it, that the photo does show some sort of balloon type object, but I'm looking forward to the day that I can get my hands on that and publish that.
Do you know by chance, was there anything mentioned of material, of what potentially a material looked like? Because I believe it said within the notes that there was some kind of payload on it, that it looked like they thought it was some type of thing hanging from it, if I read that correctly. Do you know the material? I have heard from people within different sources too, and this is not confirmed as well, is that allegedly when the item was shot down, or the craft or whatever it may be was shot down, that it ended up shattering instantly. And that's why they couldn't find the pieces. But again, that's not confirmed. That's a lot of hearsay that I've heard within the Canadian aspect of this story. But have you heard of what a material might be or anything like that? Or if it was some form of like hard material?
Yeah, sorry, I'd have to pull up my notes, which I don't have directly in front of me, but there was emails within these declassified documents describing it as a balloon-like object, metallic, with a tethered payload, so something hanging from wires or ropes underneath it, which really fits the definition of a balloon. What those materials were, I don't know. There was a search and recovery effort that was launched to try to find debris from this. That effort only lasted days until it was called off due to, what officials said was the remoteness of the terrain and severe weather. This is the Yukon Territory. This is northwestern Canada. It's very cold and bitter there in, the winter months. But officially speaking, there's been no reports of any debris being recovered. As to what it is, there was a hobbyist balloon group that claimed that it could have been theirs, that they lost contact with a high altitude balloon around the same place in the same time. But all of this remains unconfirmed. And it just sort of boggles my mind how we're sitting here a year and a half later with more questions than answers. This public affairs official said releasing this image would create questions and confusion. I think we have a heck of a lot more questions and confusion because of the lack of information and the lack of data that's come out. We get a lot of high quality information when Russian aircraft are intercepted in Arctic waters than we did with these, three unidentified objects shot down over the continent. It's time for answers.
Why you create more conspiracy theories when you are not being more forthright, right? What's wrong with showing this image if we know that it potentially was a balloon or something else? So they have not actually identified it though, correct?
It's as far as
It's
I'm aware, it's never been positively identified to the public by, NORAD, the U.S. and Canadian military authorities. I think the line they landed on was suspected balloon. Again, the descriptions in the emails that we published with the story seem to fit that description. It boggles my mind a little bit why there's been no official confirmation of any of that. There's a few theories that they shot down something very sensitive. That's why it's secret. They shot down something so innocuous that it's would be embarrassing to reveal the details. That's totally on the flip side. I mean, all we're left with is, speculation and questions because of this lack of data. I think this image should have come out at the time. It shouldn't take a year and a half and freedom of information requests to unveil this kind of stuff. And one important thing worth mentioning, while I do file many information requests myself and have filed some on these incidents, this one came to me from an anonymous researcher an anonymous Canadian researcher who found this material through their own request, sent it to me, then we had it verified. So if anyone listening has any juicy documents that they're sitting on, send them over. I'm always willing to look through this stuff.
Could one of the reasons be potentially that the Canadian government decided not to come forward with these images because they were worried it would show some type of vulnerability to our foreign adversaries? And also, whose responsibility is it? Is it the government's responsibility to know what's going on in our airways, or is it somebody else's?
Yeah. Interestingly, I put this one up on Twitter. I didn't write a story about it, but I uncovered some notes based on a meeting held between U.S. President Joe Biden and Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau right after these incidents, where they discussed the need to have UAP and balloon regulations through a United Nations aviation agency. That was put forward as a suggestion. I don't know if anything's ever come of that. I mean, it remains, at least in North America, it remains NORAD's responsibility to track and identify this kind of stuff. And I think what the incident does show and does reveal is a huge vulnerability in our defenses. NORAD, which is the joint Canada, US, North American Air Defense Alliance, they're tasked with monitoring and identifying anything entering our airspace. Through my freedom of information work, I found other incidents in recent years before the Chinese surveillance balloon where NORAD was detecting high altitude balloons following the jet stream. And before this incident, when they would detect things like this, the response would usually be, it doesn't pose a threat, it's a balloon, just let it go by. I think they're probably recalibrated how they're going to respond to these things in the future because of, what this Chinese balloon showed us. But at the same time, yeah, it shows huge vulnerabilities. NORAD was looking for conventional aircraft. They were looking for bombers and jets and missiles, and that's what they were tuned and calibrated to look for. And the whole balloon thing showed that there were holes in our continental defense, for sure.
Lots of them throughout all of North America. There's so many. We hear of pilots. We have people that can't even identify Starlink. And that's why I asked, whose job is this? For the past, I think it's been the past year or two, Sky Project Canada was announced, and it's been looking into coming out with a report about identify flying objects within Canada. Have you heard when that report might come out? And then will they be mentioning potentially, do you think, the Yukon incident as well? And how would they maybe potentially be referencing it, in your opinion?
Well, I don't want to speculate on what that report is going to contain. I have been told that the report will be released before the end of this year. And I hope once, I am able to get a copy of it, I really hope to be able to report on that in the near future. It should be noted, though, that, this report, it's called the Sky Canada Project. It's from the Office of the Chief Science Advisor of Canada, who's basically like a arm's length scientific advisor to the Prime Minister and the cabinet and his cabinet. So they're on totally their own initiative. They're doing a report that seeks to describe UAP procedures in Canada and offer recommendations for improvement, if any. Based on what I know of, how these things are recorded in Canada, there is room for improvement. The report that they're going to put out, though, is not going to deal with any cases or sightings themselves. It's really focused on the procedural aspect of how these incidents are captured. Perhaps in the future, maybe they might be inspired to do a second report, that does focus on cases or other aspects of this phenomenon. I don't know. But I really look forward to seeing what they come up with. But even if they come up with great recommendations for improving data collection on UAP in Canada, there's no guarantee that the federal government will adopt the recommendations that they're giving. So, this whole report I think it's going to be interesting, but it's a big question mark. But it's October. Maybe within the next 2 months we'll see it.
What do you think the average person is thinking in Canada when they see your reports come out? From my perspective, and we're both Canadians, when you look at it from an American perspective, it's such a conversational point, especially in media. What do you think the average person's thinking when they're reading it? Because tons of traffic went to that piece. We're saying potentially one of the biggest pieces on CTV this month, or maybe potentially the year. But we're seeing that Canadians are interested. What are they saying when they reach out to you and going, do they want to know more? Do they believe it? Do they think it's a nothing burger? What's their thoughts? What are you hearing?
Well, I can tell you, as a journalist in 2024, there's a lot of cultural hostility towards the media and journalists. I write all kinds of things. I don't exclusively report on UAP. It's definitely one of my beats. I do a lot of freedom of information work on government expenditures and waste and things like that too. I have to say, though, I probably in my journalistic career, I've received the most positive feedback for the UAP reporting. And I get a lot of emails for all kinds of stories, but definitely I probably get the most and overall the most positive about the UAP stuff. I think for people, I hear a lot from Canadians who've seen strange things themselves. And, for them, it's kind of a confirmation and a vindication to see these issues being discussed in a major media outlet. There's a lot of people who are really interested in this field. And the feedback is like overwhelmingly positive. And, and I think part of that too has to do with my approach, right? Like all the stories I'm publishing, they're based on verifiable documents, on the record testimony. I want this reporting, and the subject is so strange that, any little holes in your work can quickly engulf everything that you're doing into that kind of abyss. And I think people recognize, I hope that the work I'm doing is, I'm treating this like any other subject that would be tackled by an investigative journalist. I'm looking for documents. I'm looking for on the record testimony. And I think that earnest, serious approach it's been totally welcome. I got a lot of positive feedback and emails, and I'm now thinking, wow, there's probably some that I haven't responded to because I get a lot. And if I haven't responded to your email, I'm sorry. I'm a dad. I have 2 kids. I have a job. I can't make hours between the minutes, but I really wish I could.
I think you do an amazing job, Daniel. Honestly, there's so many people that are on the record, and there's so many American outlets and Canadian outlets that do not do that, right? They use inside sources, they say, and they're not verified, and we can't verify them. And everything you do from a journalistic standard is, I think, some of the best work that we've seen, especially in Canada. So kudos to that. How transparent do you think the Canadian government is with this topic? We see that American government might be a little bit more transparent, not just because they want to be, but it's for the fact that we have a lot of people asking questions. We have so many people that are advocating for truth and transparency. There is something called the disclosure movement that's happening and has been for years now. But within the Canadian government, it's a little hush hush. And is it intentional, do you think, or is it because we're a little bit more conservative as a country?
I think there's lots of things at play here. I don't think we can refer to the Canadian government as like one cohesive entity.
For sure.
Interestingly, in the US, you can get your congressman or senator to give you a 30-minute conversation on UAP. That's not really going to happen as much here unless you're talking to the great Manitoba member of parliament, Larry Maguire. He's kind of the only outspoken politician, although others are interested. But their interest is more of a private thing. In Canada, it's a lot harder to get officials to speak about this issue. But we also have a much easier time getting information through our freedom of information system. In the United States, the officials will give you statements and talk to you about it. Try to get any documents, you're going to be shut down because, under freedom of information laws, you can withhold documents on national security grounds. And in the United States, the UAP issue is very much being treated as a potential national security concern. It's not really the case here in Canada. I think these things are treated more as a scientific curiosity, if anything. So, through the freedom of information system, I'm able to pull, Air Force reports, NORAD logs, lots of data. But nobody's going to really give you statements or talk to you about what you find. So it's a bit of a double-edged sword. And then within the Canadian government, in my reporting, I'm usually seeking out statements from different departments and branches of the government. I can tell you from experience that, Transport Canada, which is the Canadian Federal Department of Transportation, they are not as forthcoming as I find as the public affairs officials within the Royal Canadian Air Force. I think I find our Air Force and NORAD public affairs officials to be consistently excellent. They're willing to share what they can. But then when you're dealing with more politicized offices in Ottawa, if I'm dealing with like the National Defense Department office based in Ottawa, everything they say is going to be much more carefully crafted than it's going to be if I go through the Royal Air Force, the Air Force, when they're talking in a much more direct way without political considerations. So it's kind of all over the place. And this recent story I did on the Yukon object kind of epitomizes that. In those email exchanges, you have senior Air Force, NORAD, and Canadian Army leaders talking about declassifying this object or declassifying the image of this object until a public affairs official from the capital, Ottawa, intervenes and says, wait a minute. You know what I mean? So we have curious individuals. There are individuals within governments who are committed to transparency, and there are individuals who are not. And it's a real mixed bag, and it's caused a lot of frustrations for sure.
Do you think the American government has a major influence on this topic over the Canadian government?
I don't know. There has been some engagements. My reporting has shown that, Canadian military officials have been in meetings and briefings with members of the UAP task force and now Arrow. Those meetings have happened. To what degree is the US exerting influence on Canada? It's hard to say if it's happening. I don't have evidence of it, but I think, like what you said earlier, Canadian officials and the Canadian government tend to be quite conservative in terms of releasing information. Like as a journalist, I know if I'm covering a story that I need to put in a phone call to a US agency, I'm going to get somebody on the phone. They're going to tell me what they can tell me. And that'll come through quickly. Whereas in Canada, our public affairs officials seem to be a lot more cautious. They're very conscious of, approvals and getting the approvals they need from higher up. It just, we don't have as much of an outspoken culture. I mean, Americans are famous for being an outspoken group of people, and it's great when you're working as a journalist. Canadians are a little more reserved.
For sure, I'd say they're reserved, especially the politicians. You're saying that not many want to get involved in the Canadian aspect. We know Larry Maguire, for sure, is a huge advocate for this topic within Canada. Are there reasons why you've heard from politicians in the Canadian space why they don't want to get involved? They feel they're going to be scrutinized. It's just too much of a topic that they don't want to talk about. They feel that they'll be discredited. Is there any reason, or it's just too much in the woo for them, maybe?
Well, I think as an elected official, I mean, you yourself know public relations. As an elected official, there's no political capital in coming out to talk about UFOs. You're either going to be perceived as being nutty, or if you're taken seriously and you're proposing, I don't know, a Canadian research program, you're going to be perceived as having your priorities in the wrong place. Because, I mean, how can we justify putting money into creating a UFO research program when there's communities in Canada without clean drinking water and there's kids sleeping under bridges?
Good point.
So I don't think there's a heck of a lot of political capital. I think Mr. Larry Maguire is in a unique position. He's been a member of parliament for a number of years. I believe he's in his 70s. It's not like he probably doesn't have as much to lose. I don't mean to sound cynical, but he can be outspoken in a way a sort of new member of parliament or somebody, with ambitions to be a leader or a cabinet minister might want to avoid that kind of scrutiny. I really thank Mr. Maguire for taking that brave step. I think that would have taken a lot of bravery initially to stick your neck out and start making statements and doing comments on this. And I really commend him. I don't think he'll be the last. I can personally say that I've communicated with other members of parliament who have an interest in what's going on in Canada. I hope others join Mr. Maguire, because this is not a political issue. I think it's a genuine national issue of scientific interest and curiosity, and we need to do a better job of collecting data on these types of sightings and making that data available for research.
I agree with you. Has anyone from the Canadian science communities or universities, we have the Dunlap Observatory at U of T, has anyone reached out to you and said, hey, let's start talking about this from a university or an academic perspective as well, and bringing in your work and others that you might know?
Well, I certainly suspect that we're going to see that kind of thing from the Sky Canada project. I've communicated with people there. And I think that's precisely what they're trying to do, is to help establish a clear scientific framework that can be used to collect more and better data on Canadian sightings for research, so we can better understand what's going on here.
That's awesome. Thank you, Daniel. I'm looking forward to seeing, hopefully, those other photos when you get your hands on them. I'm excited that those will potentially be coming out, and we'll see what the Canadian government says about it. And hopefully we'll get a clear answer if it's a yes or no, and we can identify what this actual object is, or if they know what the actual object is, then people in society will be able to have a clear understanding. Because right now, I think what we were discussing, it's starting to become its own conspiracy theory in Canada. So
Sure.
we need to clear it up, and we need to have a better understanding of what this is, and also to understand what's in our skies. So thank you so much for joining me today, and thank you for being rebelliously curious.
Hey, thanks so much for having me and tolerating all my coughing.